The riddle of the Sphinx. The idea of Superman is closely connected with the problem of time and eternity, with the riddle of the Sphinx. In this lie both its attraction and its danger too. This is why it so strongly affects the souls of men. As previously noted, modern psychology does not realize the immense danger of certain themes, ideas, and questions. Even in primitive philosophy, when men divided ideas into divine and human, they understood better the existence of different orders of ideas. Modern thought does not recognize this at all. Existing psychology and the theory of knowledge do not teach people to discriminate between different orders of ideas, nor point out that some ideas are very dangerous and cannot be approached without long and complex preparation. This occurs because modern psychology generally does not take into consideration the reality of ideas, and does not understand this reality. To a modern mind, ideas are an abstraction from fact. In our eyes, ideas have no existence of themselves. That is why we get so badly burned when we touch certain ideas. For us, facts that do not exist are considered real, and ideas that alone exist are unreal. Ancient and medieval psychology understood better the position of the human mind in relation to ideas. It understood that mind could not deal with ideas in the right way as long as the reality of the idea was not clear to it. Furthermore, the old psychology understood that mind was incapable of receiving ideas of different kinds simultaneously, or out of the right order. That is, it could not pass without preparation, from ideas of one order to ideas of another order. It understood the danger of such irregular and disorderly dealing with ideas. The question then is, of what must this preparation consist? Of what do the allegories of mysteries and magic ritual speak? Firstly, they speak of the necessity of an adequate knowledge for every order of ideas, because there are things that cannot be approached without preliminary knowledge. In other domains we understand this perfectly. It is impossible without adequate knowledge to handle a complicated machine. It is impossible without knowledge and practice to drive a railway engine or fly an airplane. It is impossible without knowing all the details to touch the various parts of a high-voltage electric motor. One is shown an electric motor, its parts are explained, and we are told, if you touch this or that part it means certain death. Everybody understands this and realizes that in order to know the machine it is necessary to learn a great deal and study for a long period of time. We realize also that machines of different kinds require different knowledge, and that by having learned to work a machine of one kind, one does not become proficient at handling all types of machinery. An idea is a machine of enormous power. But this is exactly what modern thought does not realize. Every idea is a complicated and delicate machine which, in order to handle correctly, it is necessary to possess a great deal of purely theoretical knowledge, then aside from that a large amount of experience and practical training is required. Unskilled handling of an idea may produce an explosion of the idea. A fire begins. The idea burns and consumes everything around it. From the perspective of modern understanding, the danger is confined to wrong reasoning, and there it ends. In reality, however, this is far from being the end of the matter. One error in reasoning leads to a whole series of others, setting off a chain reaction. Certain ideas are so powerful, contain such an amount of hidden energy, that either a right or a wrong deduction from them will inevitably produce enormous results. There are ideas that reach the most hidden recesses of the human soul and which, once they have affected thus, leave an everlasting trace. Furthermore, if the idea is taken out of context it leaves a wrong trace, leading a person astray and poisoning their life. A wrongly received idea of Superman acts precisely in this way. It detaches one from life, sows deep discord in their soul and giving us nothing and depriving all of what we had previously. Fyodor Dostoevsky illustrates this in Crime and Punishment using the character of Raskolnikov. It is not the fault of the idea itself, but of a wrong approach to it. Of what, then, must a right approach consist? The idea of Superman has points of contact with the problem of time and with the idea of the infinite. It is not possible to touch the idea of Superman without having cleared up first the means of approach to the problem of time and to the idea of the infinite. The problem of time and the idea of the infinite contain laws governing the action of the apparatus. Without knowing these laws, one cannot know what effect will be produced by their touching the machine, by pulling one lever or another, by pressing a button. The problem of time is the greatest riddle that humanity has ever had to face. Religious revelation, philosophical thought, scientific investigation and occult knowledge all converge at one point, that is, on the problem of time. All come to the same view of it. Time does not exist. There exists no perpetual and eternal appearance and disappearance of phenomena. No ceaselessly flowing fountain of ever appearing and vanishing events. Everything exists always. There is only one eternal present, the eternal now, which the weak and limited human mind can neither grasp nor conceive. But the idea of the eternal now is not the idea of a cold and merciless predetermination of everything, of an exact and infallible pre-existence. It would be quite wrong to say that if everything already exists, if the remote future exists now, if our actions, thoughts and feelings have existed for tens, hundreds, and maybe even thousands of years, that they will continue to exist forever, then it means that there is no life, no movement, no growth, and no evolution. People say this because they fail to understand the infinite and want to measure the immeasurable depths of eternity with weak and finite minds. Of course, they arrive at the most hopeless of all possible solutions to the problem. Everything is, nothing can change. Everything exists beforehand and eternally. Everything is dead and immovable in frozen forms amidst which beats our consciousness that has created for itself the illusion of the movement of everything around it, movement which in reality does not exist. But even such a weak and relative understanding of the idea of infinity as is possible for human intellect, provided only that it develops along the right lines, is sufficient to destroy this gloomy phantom of hopeless immobility. The world is full of infinite possibilities. Our mind, however, follows the development of possibilities always in one linear direction only. But in actual fact, every moment contains a very large number of possibilities. And all of them are actualized, only we do not see it and do not know it. We always see only one of the actualizations, and in this lies the poverty and limitation of the human mind. If we try instead to imagine the actualization of all possibilities of the present moment, then of the next moment and so on, we will feel the world growing infinitely, incessantly multiplying by itself, becoming immeasurably rich and utterly unlike the flat and linear world we have pictured to ourselves up until this moment. Having imagined this infinite variety, we can feel a taste of infinity for a moment, understand how inadequate and impossible it is to approach the problem of time with earthly measures. We understand what an infinite richness of time going in all directions is necessary for the actualization of all the possibilities that arise out of any given moment. We shall understand that the very idea of arising and disappearing possibilities is created by the human mind, because otherwise it would burst and perish from a single contact with the infinite actualization. Simultaneously with this, we feel the unreality of all pessimistic deductions as compared with the vastness of unfolding horizons. We feel that the world is so boundlessly large that a thought of the existence of any limits in it, a thought of there being anything whatsoever which is not contained within, will appear to us ridiculous. Where then are we to seek for a true understanding of time and infinity? Where to seek for this infinite extension in all directions from every moment? What ways lead to it? What ways lead to the future which exists now? Where to find right methods of dealing with it? Where to find right methods of dealing with the idea of Superman? These are questions to which modern thought gives no answer. However, human thought has not always been so helpless in the face of these problems. There have existed and there exist other attempts to solve the riddles of life. The idea of Superman belongs to the inner circle. Ancient religions and myths always pictured in the image of Superman the higher I of man, man's consciousness. This higher I or higher consciousness was always represented as being almost separate from ordinary man, but in a certain sense, living within man. It depended upon man himself, whether he drew nearer to this being, became it or turned aside from it, even broke away from it altogether. Very often the image of Superman as a being belonging to the future, or to the golden age, to the mythical present symbolizing this inner being, the higher I, the Superman in the past, the present and the future. What was symbol and what was reality depended upon the way of thinking of the particular individual in question. People who were inclined to regard the outer as objectively existing considered the inner to be a symbol of the outer. People who understood differently and knew that the outer did not mean the objective considered outer facts to be symbols of the possibilities of the inner world. In reality, the idea of Superman has never existed apart from the idea of higher consciousness. The ancient world was never superficially materialistic. It knew how to penetrate the depths of an idea and how to find in it not only one meaning, but many. The world of today, having made the idea of Superman concrete in one sense, has deprived it of its inner power and freshness. Superman as a zoological species is above all tedious. It is possible and admissible only as higher consciousness. So, what is higher consciousness? Here it is necessary to note that any division into higher or lower, as for instance the division of higher and lower mathematics, is always artificial. In reality, of course, the lower is nothing but a limited concept of the whole, and the higher a broader, less limited concept. In relation to consciousness, this question of higher and lower stands thus. The lower consciousness is a limited self-consciousness of the whole, while the higher consciousness is a fuller self-consciousness. You have made your way from worm to man, and much is still in you of the worm. Once were ye apes, and even yet is man more of an ape than any of the apes. Thus spake Zarathustra. Of course, these words of Zarathustra have nothing to do with the theories of Charles Darwin. Nietzsche spoke of the discord in the soul of man, of the struggle between the past and the future. He understood the tragedy of man that lies in the fact that in his soul there lives simultaneously a worm, an ape, and a man. In what relation then does such an understanding of the idea of Superman stand to the problem of time and to the idea of the infinite? Where to seek for time and for infinity? Once again, in the soul of man is the answer to the ancient teachings. Everything is within man, as it exists outside of him. How is this to be understood? Time is not a condition of the existence of the universe, but only a condition of the perception of the world by our psychic apparatus, which imposes on the world conditions of time. Otherwise the psychic apparatus would be unable to conceive it. Western thought, at least the evolving part of it, the part that builds no dogmatic barriers for itself, also finds further possibilities of studying problems of time. In passing to questions of psychology, see the works of Minkowski. The passing to questions of psychology in problems of space and time, of the necessity for which Minkowski speaks, would mean for natural science the acceptance of Kant's proposition that time and space are nothing but forms of our sense perception and originate in our psychic apparatus. We are, however, unable to conceive infinity without relation to space and time. Therefore, if space and time are forms of our perception and lie in our soul, then it follows that the roots of infinity can be sought also within us, within our soul. We may perhaps define it as an infantile possibility of the expansion of our consciousness. The depths hidden within the consciousness of man were well understood by philosopher mystics whose thoughts were closely connected with parallel systems of Hermetic philosophy, alchemy, the Kabbalah, and others. Man contains within himself heaven and hell, it is said. Representations of man often show him with the different faces of God and the worlds of light and darkness within. They affirmed that by penetrating within the depths of himself, man could find everything, attain everything. What is attained, however, depends upon what is sought, and how it is sought after. They did not understand this as an allegory. The soul of man actually appeared to them as a window, or as several windows looking on infinity. Man in ordinary life appeared to them as living as it were on the surface of himself, ignorant and even unconscious of what lies in his own depths. If he thinks of infinity, he conceives it as only outside of him. In reality, infinity is also within him, and by consciously penetrating within his soul, man can find infinity within himself, can come into contact with it and enter into it. Gichtel, a mystic of the 17th century, gives a drawing of the perfect man in his book Theosophia Practica. The perfect man is the Kabbalist, Adam Kadmon, i.e. humanity or mankind of which an individual man is a copy. The drawing on the left represents the figure of a man on whose head, on the forehead, is shown the Holy Ghost. In the heart, Jesus. In the solar plexus, Jehovah. The upper part of his chest with the organs of respiration, and possibly the organs of speech contains wisdom, or the mirror of God, and the lower part of the body with its organs of reproduction contains the dark world, or the root of souls in the center of the universe. This drawing represents in man 5 ways to infinity. Man can choose any of these ways, and what he finds will depend upon his direction, that is on which way he journeys. Man has become so earthly and outward, says Gichtel, that he seeks afar, beyond the starry sky, in the higher eternity what is quite near him, within the inner center of his soul. When the soul begins to strive to divert its will from the exterior constellation and abandon everything visible in order to turn to God, to its center, this requires desperate work. The more the soul penetrates within itself, the nearer it approaches God, until it finally stops before the Holy Trinity. Then it has reached deep knowledge. Such an inward understanding of the idea of infinity is much truer and deeper than the outward understanding of it, and it gives a more correct approach to the idea of Superman, a clearer understanding of it. If infinity lies within the soul of man and if he is able to come into contact with it by penetrating within himself, this means that the future and Superman are in his soul, that he can find them within himself if he seeks them in the right way. The peculiarity and distinctive feature of the ideas of the real world, i.e. of the world as it is, are that viewed in a positivist light they appear absurd. This is a necessary condition. This condition and the necessity for it are never properly understood, and that is why the ideas of the world of many dimensions often produce on people such a nightmare effect. Superman is one of the possibilities that lie within the depths of the soul of man. It rests within man himself to bring this idea nearer, or to turn it aside. The nearness or remoteness of Superman from man lies not in time, but in man's attitude towards the idea, and not only in a mental attitude but in an active and practical relation to it. Man is separated from Superman not by time, but by the fact that he is not prepared to receive Superman. The whole of time lies within man himself. This is the inner obstacle to a direct sensation of one thing or another, and it is nothing else. The building of the future, the serving of the future are but symbols of man's attitude towards himself, towards his own present. It is clear that if this view is accepted and if it is recognized that all the future is contained within man himself, it will then be naive to ask, what have I to do with Superman? It is evident what man has to do with Superman, for Superman is man himself. Yet the view of Superman as the higher I of man, as something within himself, does not contain all possible understanding. Knowledge of the world as it is something subtle and more complex. It does not require any denial of the outward existence of the phenomena in question. The outward aspect of the phenomena is in this case known by man in its relation to the inward aspect. Furthermore, the distinct characteristic of right knowledge is the absence of any negation of it, particularly the absence of negation of an opposite view. Real, i.e. many-dimensional and complete knowledge differs from material or logical, i.e. unreal, knowledge above all in its not excluding the opposite view. True knowledge includes in itself all contradictory views, of course after first divesting them of artificial complications and superstitious interpretations. It must be understood that the absence of negation of the opposite does not mean necessarily acceptance of the false, the illusory, and the superstitious. Knowledge is a correct separation of the true from the false, and this is reached not by negation but by means of inclusion. Truth includes all in itself, and what cannot enter it shows by this very fact its falsity and incorrectness. In truth there are antitheses. Thesis and antithesis are identical in nature, but varying by degree. One view does not exclude another. Therefore, in relation to the idea of Superman only that understanding is true which includes both views, the outer and the inner. We have no grounds for denying the possibility of a real living Superman in the past, in the present or in the future. At the same time we must recognize in our inner world the presence of seeds of something higher than that by which we ordinarily live. We must recognize the possibility of the sprouting of these seeds, and their manifestation in forms at present incomprehensible to us. Superman in the past or in the future does not stand in contradiction to the possibility of higher consciousness in man living now. On the contrary, the one reveals the other. Men who are conscious of Superman within them, who are conscious of the revealing of new forces within them, become by virtue of this very fact connected with the idea of Superman in the past or in the future. Men who seek for a real living Superman in the present thereby reveal a higher principle in their own souls. The idea of Superman is difficult to understand and therefore dangerous because it makes necessary the knowledge of how to accord two opposite views. An outer aspect alone of this idea, or an inner aspect alone cannot satisfy anyone. Each of these aspects is also wrong in its own way. Each of them is in its way a distortion of the idea. In a distorted form this idea becomes its own opposite, and not only fails to elevate man, but on the contrary thrusts him down towards pessimistic negation, bringing him to a passive non-doing, to lethargy, or even a complete stop. Disillusionment with life and the aims of life when aroused by the idea of Superman comes from a wrong understanding of it, mostly from the feeling of the remoteness and inaccessibility of Superman in outer life. On the other hand, an exclusively inner understanding of the idea of Superman also detaches one from life and makes all activity useless and unnecessary in our eyes. If Superman is within me, if it is only necessary to descend deep within myself in order to find him, what is the use of all attempts to do anything to find him outside of myself? These are two submerged rocks lying in the depths of the idea of Superman. Man finds Superman within himself when he begins to look for Superman outside himself. And he can find Superman outside himself when he has begun to look for Superman within himself. Having understood and visualized the image of Superman such as he can be, man must reconstruct the whole of his life so that it does not contradict this image, if he can. This will reveal the idea of Superman in his soul. An intellectual approach to the idea of Superman is possible only after a very long and persistent training of the mind. Ability to think is the first necessary stage of initiation that ensures safety in approaching the idea. What does it mean then to be able to think? It means to be able to think differently from the way in which we are accustomed to thinking, that is to say to conceive the world in new categories. We have simplified our conception of the world too much, we have become accustomed to picture it to ourselves as too uniform, and we must now learn anew to understand its complexity. In order to do so it is necessary to understand again and to understand once more in a new way that we have no knowledge of what man is, and to realize that man is undoubtedly something quite different from that we think him to be. In our hearts we know certain things very well, but we can never concentrate on them. We understand a certain cycle of ideas, but live in another cycle of ideas. Life turns around us and we turn around it, and around us turn our shadows. Nothing is outside us. But we forget this at every sound, thus spake Zarathustra. In the Jewish legends of the Talmud there is a remarkable story about Moses that contains the whole idea of the evolution of man in the true sense of the word. It is contained in Agada, legends, parables, and sayings from the Talmud and the Midrashs, written in 4 parts. The portrait of Moses. The whole world was shaken and enthralled by the miracle of the Exodus. The name of Moses was on everyone's lips. Tidings of the great miracle reached the wise king of Arabistan. The king summoned to him his best painter and bade him go to Moses to paint his portrait and bring it back to him. When the painter returned the king gathered together all his sages, wise in the science of physiognomics and asked then to define by the portrait, the character of Moses, his qualities, inclinations, habits, and the source of his miraculous power. King, answered the sages, this is the portrait of a man cruel, haughty and greedy of gain, possessed of desire for power by all the vices that exist in the world. These words roused the king's indignation. How can it be possible, he exclaimed, that a man whose marvelous deeds ring through the whole world should be of such a kind? A dispute began between the painter and the sages. The painter affirmed that the portrait of Moses had been painted by him quite accurately, while the sages maintained that Moses' character had been unerringly determined by them according to the portrait. The wise king of Arabistan decided to verify which of the disputing parties was right and he himself set off for the camp of Israel. At the first glance the king became convinced that the face of Moses had been faultlessly portrayed by the painter. On entering the tent of the man of God he knelt down, bowed to the ground and told Moses of the dispute between the artist and the sages. At first, until I saw thy face, said the king, I thought it must be that the artist had painted thy image badly, for my sages are men very much experienced in the science of physiognomics. Now I am convinced that they are quite worthless men and that their wisdom is vain and worthless. No, answered Moses, it is not so. Both the painter and the physiognomists are men highly skilled and both parties are right. Be it known to thee that all the vices of which the sages spoke have indeed been assigned to me by nature and perhaps to an even higher degree than was found by them from my portrait. But I have struggled with my vices by long and intense efforts of the will and gradually overcame and suppressed them in myself until all opposed to them became my second nature. And in this lies my greatest pride.